In this presentation, I'm going over very quickly the periodic table basics. Okay, so the periodic table is just that, a table that organizes the elements based on their properties. So elements with similar properties are going to be close to each other. For example, some of the properties that we're going to go over as we move on are like the reactivity of the elements, the size of the atoms or the elements, electronegativity, and all of those properties can be predicted looking at the location of the elements on this table. The elements on the periodic table can be divided into periods and groups, and we're going over what periods and groups are in a moment. But then the groups are also divided into elements that belong to the main groups and elements that belong to the transition elements. Another thing that is important about the periodic table is how the periodic table is represented in a page. For all of the elements to fit in a single page, we have two rows that are placed at the bottom part of the periodic table. Those elements are still part of the elements that you have listed above. It's just that if those rows are placed where they belong on the periodic table, then the periodic table is going to be too long to fit in a single page. For each element that is listed on the periodic table, we have the same notation. For each element, we're able to see the symbol that is representing the element. Under the symbol of the element, we can see the atomic mass for that specific element. For hydrogen, for example, the symbol for hydrogen is H. The mass that is listed on the periodic table is 1.008. The mass, we're going to learn what that number represents, where that number is coming from, what units do we assign to that number. And also we have an atomic number. The atomic number is giving you the identity of the elements. So if you don't know the name or the symbol for an element, but you know the atomic number, you can actually know which element is the one that you're referring to. So if I talk about element number 5 on the periodic table, for example, I'm referring to boron. So I mentioned that the elements on the periodic table are divided into the main groups and the transition metals, right? And also that we have what is known as periods and groups. The groups on the periodic table are vertical columns. The periods, they go across the periodic table. We have 7 periods on the periodic table and 18 groups on the periodic table. So the 7 periods, I'm going to write down the numbers 1 through 7, starting where you have hydrogen and going down. Those are representing the periods. Now, periods, they go across the periodic table. So, for example, period 1, it's hydrogen, and on the other side, we have helium. So, period 1 on the periodic table only contains those two elements, hydrogen and helium. For period 2 on the periodic table, starting on the left side, moving all the way to the right side, we start where you have lithium, beryllium, and then you move to the other side where you start with boron all the way to neon. And you can keep going down on the periodic table, and all periods, they work on the same way, from left towards the right side on the periodic table or across the periodic table. Now, the groups, I'm going to use my own way of numbering the groups on the periodic table. So 1 through 8, starting on the left where you have hydrogen, and remember groups are vertical columns. So when I'm writing down that 1 on top of hydrogen, I'm referring to group 1, which is all of that column starting with hydrogen, ending with francium at the very end of the column. So 1 through 8 is the numbers that I'm using to refer to the main groups on the periodic table. For example, if I'm talking about an element in group 4 that it's in period 2 on the periodic table, I'm referring to carbon. Carbon is in group 4, and when you check your period number, that's a second period. So it's important for you to be able to identify elements based on their group number or the period in which they are. Okay? So out of the 8 main groups that I have identified on the periodic table, 4 of them are referred by an actual name. Elements in group 1 are referred to the alkali metals, with the exception of hydrogen. We're going to learn another way of classifying elements besides elements belonging to a specific group or a specific period on the periodic table. Hydrogen is classified as a nonmetal. So if hydrogen is a nonmetal, it cannot be an alkali metal. So starting with lithium in group number 1, we have the alkali metals. Group number 2, where we have beryllium, right? That group or that vertical column, those elements are known as the alkaline earth metals. We move to the right side of the periodic table, and in group 7, we have the halogens. And then group 8, out of your 8 main groups, group 8 also has a name, or we can refer to those elements as the noble gases. Now, the middle part of the periodic table are the transition metals. So we have your groups 1 through 18. You can see that you have 18 columns. Out of the 18 columns, I'm assigning numbers 1 through 8 to the main groups, and then all of the remaining elements in the middle part of the periodic table are known as the transition metals. So we can classify the elements into these 3 main categories, and that will be based on their physical and chemical properties. So we have elements that can be classified as metals, and they share these properties that I have listed here. They're shiny, you can form flat surfaces with them without breaking them apart. They are ductile, which means that we can form wires with them. For example, copper is a metal, and we can form wires that we use to transfer electricity. Another property for the metals is that they are good conductors of heat and electricity. The second category is the metalloids. The metalloids are going to be elements that are sharing properties with the metals, and also with the third category, which is the nonmetals. They can conduct heat and electricity, but not as good as the metals, but better as the nonmetals, which is that third category. So for the nonmetals, they are the opposite of the metals in the sense that the metals, when you have a piece of a metal or an element that is classified as a metal, like for example gold, silver, copper, they are shiny. When you have a sample of an element from the periodic table that is classified as a non-metal, the appearance is dull, they're not shiny, and they are poor conductors of heat and electricity. So the last thing to mention about the periodic table is how can we identify the 3 types of elements that we have, or those 3 main categories: the metals, the nonmetals, and the metalloids. So on the periodic table, like I am showing you here, highlighted in green, the elements that are classified as metalloids. In pink, you have the elements that are classified as non-metals. And then I'm missing an important non-metal, and this is very worth mentioning because hydrogen is placed all the way here on the left side on the periodic table. Because its element number 1 is the very first one, it actually shares some properties with the metals that we have listed on that group on the periodic table, which is group number 1. But hydrogen is actually a non-metal. Okay? So you can see that the periodic table is divided into like two sides. In general, on the left side of the metalloids, we have the elements that are classified as metals. You have your metals in the main groups, which is groups 1, 2, and 3. And we have the metals that are classified as the transition metals, which are the ones that we have right here in the middle of the periodic table. Then on the right side of the metalloids, we have the nonmetals with the exception of hydrogen, which is on top of group number 1. Remember that you have 18 groups on the periodic table, and I'm using this way of numbering the groups from 1 through 8 for the main groups, starting with group number 1 where you have your alkali metals, group number 2 where you have the alkaline earth metals, and then we move to the right side of the periodic table with those main groups. Okay, so the numbers here 1 through 8 are showing you the main groups on the periodic table. We have names for group number 1, number 2, group number 7, and number 8. For example, elements in group number 7 are the halogens, so you should remember all of that information. Okay? And one last thing to review, we have 7 periods on the periodic table. Remember, your groups are the vertical columns, so we have 18 of those, and 7 periods because your periods, they go across the periodic table. So your period 1 starts here with hydrogen and helium, and then you go down all the way here. That will be your period number 7, which is starting in francium and ending all the way to the other side of the periodic table.